of our lives. The intention that we have, we don't have any formalities really here as some organization might have with grace or what have you. It's basically we can set the intention for ourselves to have this be a positive experience where we can share ideas and hopefully in our sharing learn more, but also be able to gain something from other people as well. We have an opportunity for announcements. We'll do that right now for a few minutes. In case somebody's got something that's coming up they want to announce. Sometimes there's other events going on. If there isn't, well, we'll pass on that for now. Maybe we'll do a quick round of introductions because there are a few new people, and I know I've heard the names a few times, but I've already forgotten them. So we'll just do a quick round of introductions. All you gotta do is say your name and just put up your hand or something like that. My name is Steve anyways, so.
Chris.
Lila.
My name is Sean. I'm back.
Kathy. Jackie.
Ryan.
Patricia. Cheryl. Chelsea.
Andrew.
Liam.
Gloria.
Rick. Kane.
Kathy.
Jane.
Mary.
Corey.
Doreen.
Murph.
Well, welcome everyone. And now, we are very fortunate this evening to have Prakash Venglat as our guest speaker for the evening. This is not common to Coffee Chat. We normally have a discussion. And this evening we have a guest speaker. Now, back in December, just before Christmas, I was invited to the Saskatoon Toastmaster Club Christmas party, of which Prakash is a member. And it was at Peter D's, if I recall. And the seating arrangement, it was an evening meal. The seating arrangements were such that I was sitting right across the table from Prakash. So I ended up talking to him most of the time. I had met Prakash a few times in contests and so on, but never really had a chance to talk to him. And we had quite an interesting discussion. And then it was about 8 o'clock. Everybody pretty much said their goodbyes, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year, and went their way. Except Prakash and I, and Carissa, who was having with my daughter, who was having, she couldn't go anywhere really. And there was one other guy, I forget his name now. As a rule, yeah. He was there for a while too, but at the end of it, it was pretty much just me and Prakash talking up till about 11 or 10 or 11 when they closed the place. And the discussion went in the way of the message of the Buddha. And I was just absolutely amazed at the depth of knowledge and the conviction and the enthusiasm that Prakash had for this message. So then I told him about Coffee Chat, and I asked him, I said, would you be interested in doing a presentation at Coffee Chat, which, to my surprise, I guess, he eagerly, he didn't even hesitate, he said sure, he would, and it was really quite amazing to me. And he even, later on, he told me that he feels that by sharing it somehow strengthens his practice in this way of life. Now, Prakash is currently the president of Saskatoon Toastmasters here in Saskatoon, and professionally he is a plant scientist here in Saskatoon as well. He describes himself as a novice of the Buddhist teaching, which, if he's a novice, I don't know what I am really, because he's got a lot to share on this. And when it comes to the Buddha's Dharma, he believes that sharing it actually strengthens his intention and practice. Prakash has to leave about 8, so he'll talk for probably about 35 minutes, and then there'll be an opportunity for discussion, question and answer sort of format. And after that, we're welcome to stay and have our regular coffee chat session, so hopefully there'll be a lot of ideas come from this that we can share and put back and forth. So Prakash's talk tonight is going to be called The Logic, or Heedfulness rather, Heedfulness, the Logic of Practicing Dharma. Let's put our hands together and give a warm welcome to Coffee Chat.
Thanks, Steve.
Oh, one other thing, if you could turn off your, or silent your cell phones.
Yes.
Yeah. Just a little interruption there. Just leave it on the waiters. I see your.
Nope, I'm in your chair.
Good evening, everyone. You know, actually, when I agreed to talk upon this topic, and decided I'll come and do it. I'm actually feeling like a guy with my pants down. The reason is, this topic is so common to our everyday process, but at the same time, if you start going into it, it's so complex. So how do you design a talk about something that's so common? And at the same time, as you go dig into it into a personal level, it can be so complex. How can you talk about it in about 30 minutes? And with that challenge in mind, what I've done is I've typed out all the details on one page here, which is just, I'm going to use it as a guideline. And the reason I chose the word heedfulness is for a particular reason. It's a very interesting word. There are a lot of words which rhyme with it. Attention is a common thing.
What's the word?
Attention.
Okay.
Or being very careful with what you're doing. All this means the same thing, but why choose heedfulness?
Okay.
The reason is because of Buddha. When he was he traveled all over trying to preach his message after he got this idea in his head that he can help people, and he started talking about it to different people. And towards the end, his last sermon or last speech, people came to him around his bed, and he was lying down, he was ready to go, and he was very peaceful. And people asked him, "So what do you want your last message to be?" He didn't talk about being enlightened. He didn't talk about all the glory of having taught many people. He just said, "Watch out. Heedfulness." That's the word he said. And he said, as long as you're heedful and you remember what you're heedful about, I've done my job. So heedfulness, again, how do we fit it into the framework of not Buddha's time, but into the current time? I was thinking of some metaphor that can help. And one thing that stood out that I thought was very interesting was the idea of wanting to look at some distant object.
Thanks. Hey, Steve. Is there a seat by you? Thanks.
Okay, let's go back to the metaphor of wanting to look at a distance. In a way, it's very similar to looking inside. When you start to look inwards, which is what Buddha's main message is, to look inwards, you start to focus on something very shallow first. And then as you start to get deeper and deeper into this practice, you learn to stabilize the process so that you can look deeper and deeper inwards, which can be very, very ancient. You can go back in time a lot by looking inwards. But just to compare with looking outwards, if you want to look at an object way far away from the earth, like stars, obviously we designed the telescopes. They are very powerful, and you can focus on different galaxies way out there. But there is a catch. The catch is, all these lenses and everything can help you focus, but you need a really stable platform. If your platform is just going to vibrate just a little bit, all the capabilities one has developed to focus is lost. A more simpler example would be a camera. Let's say you have a good camera which has 50x zoom, for example. You take it out into the field, you see a deer or a moose or whatever at distance, and you focus on it, and you click the picture, but you forgot to turn on a simple button. It's called vibration reduction or image stabilization. If you forget to click on it, the image you're going to get is going to be really blurry. So the stability of your observation goes down. That's the whole idea. So the word heedfulness is coming back into the context of heedfulness. The word heedfulness combines both. It combines the sensory acumen or sharpness with stability. These two things go hand in hand when you talk about heedfulness. So how do you consider stability from the point of view of practice? That's the next question. And that's where I think Buddha comes in. Normally when you want to, when you're going to pay attention, this is a common thing that happens as a reflex. Our sensory modalities become really active. We want to observe things, so we use all our senses to a full potential. But it is those same senses. That's why this is a very paradoxical situation, because it is the same senses that let you observe that prevents you from traveling inwards. Because any input you get, the sensory modalities become really active. And then they keep you right at the gate and they don't let you enter inwards. It kind of gates your own self. So how do you open up the gate just a little bit? So that you can step in first, feel comfortable. And once you're comfortable, then you know that actually there's a gate. You can open it every now and then. And once you can do it every now and then, you'll feel comfortable in that zone. So finding that zone is a very difficult thing. To start off with, it's almost like a wall. You don't have anything, no openings. And you want to probe into it, you chisel on the wall and try to make a window and look through to the other side. And then slowly you start to see you can make a door. And Buddha's conundrum there was, how do you teach this to people? That actually, this is not a solid wall. This is a wall that you've created over times, in your own lifetime. And that's where Buddha's ideas about many lifetimes come. He talks about many lifetimes. And the reason is, it's not a question of a metaphysical conundrum. It's a very physical event where he talks about in terms of how we have developed over time. We didn't just emerge out of nothing. We came from other animals. And if you look at the earlier forms of our own cells, the sensory modalities were very, you can find layers upon layers that has been built over time. So the early animals had to sense their environment, and we still have a large component that is operating in our brain that makes us work in that mode. So what Buddha had to do is, he had to turn the people's awareness all the way around. He said, you need all of those, but wait a second. How do you know you're using it the right way? And the way you can use it the right way is to be able to observe it. In a way, the conundrum there is observing your own self. How do you start doing it? And that's the biggest paradox, even for me when I started, even now sometimes. You'll find that it becomes a mirror reflecting on a mirror, and you just get caught in that loop. But it's not a loop. And that's the power of Buddha's message, is that it's not a loop. It looks like a loop when you start off. But as you work your way downwards, you see a clear path. The first loop is like a wall. You see a wall, you break it, you see another wall. You break it, you see another wall. That's your early form of practice. But you keep at it, eventually you'll see that you don't have to break the whole wall. You chisel a little bit, still have the wall, look through it. You see the other side of the whole event. Then you don't even break the wall, the door opens for you. You start to see a door open for you. And once you start to see that, then you're at the beginning of the practice. And that's why I refer to myself as a novice, because I think I'm somewhere between breaking a hole in the wall and trying to open a door. So once you get more time to experiment with that, the challenge is to find the required amount of time every day. But eventually, I think the reason why I said sharing this intensifies practice is because when you share it with others, then you develop the teaching in your mind in a much more concrete manner. All these things are, very not physical initially, and so these come through your brain, float away, and then disappear. And then somebody else talks to you about this, and then it appears again, it floats away. But once you start to communicate it with others, that's when it becomes the actual Dharma. Dharma is some teaching that you share for the betterment of yourself and for others. And so what Buddha did in his time, it's very important to go back in his time and see how he went about doing it in his early stages. So Buddha means the awakened one. But the awakening is not some euphoric enlightenment that we see in the current literature. I think that's a very very end of the path conundrum. Like it's at the end of the path you can talk about the euphoria of enlightenment and all that. But even then, I think if you really look into it, Buddha's last words were heedfulness. He didn't talk about enlightenment. So I think there's a very key message there. So you can go looking for all these sort of states, euphoric states, be it enlightenment, or it could be some other state of intoxication. It becomes a state of intoxication. Initially, it's a state of awareness, but if you hold on to it, then it's a state of intoxication because your brain gets filled up with it, and its awareness, its sensory inputs are all focused on something very shallow, not deep. And that's a big challenge that you'll face as you start to practice in this modality. Okay, so again, let's go back to the whole idea of how do we look inwards now, starting with being heedful to look inwards. So what Buddha did at his time was he came up with this. Let me just step back for a second because I think it'll be interesting to tell a story here because I think most of you might be aware, but I think just to put this into context, I'm going to briefly say it. Buddha, how did he go about getting into this whole mode of questioning? That's a very important fact because I think what eventually happens in Buddha's text is initially he's very instructive. He's telling you like a teacher. But after some time, once you become a student, he's not a teacher anymore, he's just your friend. And then once you become closer and closer to being in the friendly mode, he makes you a colleague, your equal. And then he says, I'm gone, you're all by yourselves. Because you are already the Buddha. That is his key message. And so if you really go back and look at how it started for him, it's very important because he was a prince in a royal family. That's how the story goes. And he's protected by his family so that he doesn't, because there was a forecast in his life that he would turn into somebody who's quite different from being a king. And so he was protected. And eventually what happened was, one day he slipped out of the palace with his chariot. And then once he rides the streets, he's traumatized by 4 events that he sees. One is he sees that people can fall sick, really sick. And then next he sees people are almost about to die, which is they're growing older. Much different than what he thought human bodies are about. They change, they grow old. And then a while later he comes to a graveyard, he sees bodies burning, people are dying. And the last thing he sees is all these people mourning the death, the grief. So the reason why he wanted to teach, why he wanted to probe into this is because he felt that the whole aspect of human suffering is a constant thing. We are in a constant mode of change. We're born. What we see today, we try to fixate and see that we are the same, but we are not. We changed every day. And the change is what causes a lot of suffering. And his whole reason to come out and teach, he says, is not to attain enlightenment. It's not to expound some big philosophy. It's just to alleviate suffering. I think that's a key thing to keep in mind. And the whole idea of being compassionate, having goodwill, everything comes in before we explore the real Dharma. So before you start practicing any form of meditation or Dharma, the first few seconds you sit, you have to become the Buddha in a way, who have seen all these traumas in his life as you witness it around you. And then you spread the goodwill to yourself and to others, to be compassionate enough to see all this without hiding away or running away. The whole idea of being compassionate or having goodwill is actually a smart exercise tool too. It makes you face the suffering. Otherwise, you can just walk away. You can do other things. We have so much of entertainment, we can switch channels. And then we don't observe it for till we are 70 or 80, and then we fall sick, or we see somebody in our family falling sick, and then it hits us. So, like I said, I mean, I'm going to, I don't want to meander away from the topic, but this is a very important component of his teaching, the underpinning basis, that there is human suffering, and this whole idea of his coming out to teach instead of meditating forever and become super enlightened was to see that how we can help people overcome suffering. I think that's the fundamental take on this. And when he got the path clear, that he found a way that he can solve this problem of what he thought was a human suffering, which is self-inflicted. When he found a way, there was a big challenge for him. Imagine the people around who are preaching different things, who are talking different things. They have their whole hierarchy of information flow, and he's going to break the common mode of teaching. He's faced with a challenge. He's sitting in front of people, and people are asking him, "So what do you have to say?" So he started with a very small group of people. And the way he started training people was by using 3 different terms. And this is a very key thing that you'll find in Buddhist literature interpreted in different ways. But it's very simple and very direct. First is the Buddha, the one who has the information.
The one who has what?
The information
Okay.
or the message. Or the one who was awakened to that particular state. The second is Dharma, his teachings, his applications that one can use it for the betterment of themselves. And the third thing was very important. It's called the Sangha. And the Sangha is nothing but the group.
What?
The group.
Group.
The group of people who are listening to it and who can put it into practice. So what he did was he created what we can call as a club, basically. It's a club. Because he found a way to bring people together and agree upon his message. And then he said, there's no use agreeing upon it. You have to practice. And how do you practice? You form a community. And that's called Sangha. And in the Sangha, when you have a group of people, you need to have rules. And that's where a lot of Buddhism became really complicated. The code of conduct, the ethics, the monastic rules. You can see a lot of Buddhist monasteries. And all these are what is called as the method, or the Vinaya. Or Vinaya is, so the Dharma never stands by itself. It's Buddha's Dharma or Dharma Vinaya. Dharma Vinaya is a group of people following certain codes of conduct using the teachings. So he had a very interesting way of building it. He started in a small way and he built this community. And I think within that community, the people were able to fire back at each other and get feedback about how exactly to go about doing this practice. So he didn't do it all by himself. The first step of his awakening was to become aware. But the second step was to use it as an effective teaching tool and bring people into the community. And so when he first brought people together, so immediately the first 5 or 6 people who were around him, they asked him, so what are you going to tell me? That I'm going to stay with you. What are you going to tell me that will keep me focused on your teachings and not just walk away to the next door teacher? So he stood there and he said, it's very simple. I have to teach you only 4 noble truths. He called it noble because he thought that it can help people. He said it's just 4 noble truths. So then these people asked, what is it? And actually if you read Buddha's texts, it's always a very interesting narrative because it's all questions. And he says the best way of inquiry is having the right skills to question your own self. So when you question your own self in different roles, how correct your questions are will determine the answer. So if you ask the right questions, then you will get the right answers. And you should know that you're asking the right questions by following certain guidelines. And what he prescribes as guidelines are these. Any question you ask to yourself at any point should rest on these 4 truths. That's what he said. When you're inquiring about this whole process, you have to rest on these 4 truths. First is, would you all agree there is suffering? He asked. And everybody said, yes, there is suffering. In some form or the other. You can be 15, 20 years old now, and then soon you'll be 40, and then your hair will start to turn gray. Or you could turn 50 and you could have diabetes. Things can change dramatically. So there is suffering. So when people agreed on that, he said, we are never aware of that. That is a big problem. So the second simple truth was that there is an understanding of that suffering. First, there is suffering. You don't sense it. It's all around you. And suddenly when it hits you, or when you see somebody else going through the problem, you say, oh yes, I understand it. The third step was, he said, once you understand it and start probing into it, asking the right questions, no matter what the suffering is, there is an end to that suffering. There's a way you can end the suffering. Because suffering out there is one thing, and the reaction to it in your head is another thing. So there is a monk whose literature I follow very closely, and he has very interesting metaphors. He says, we are like vacuum cleaners. And that really struck me. He said, we are like vacuum cleaners. We just suck up all the dust that comes at us and just store it. You don't have to. You can watch the dust, understand it. If you can alleviate its suffering, then you entangle with it. Then your mind is trying to understand it. It's not there is suffering, it's trying to understand it. If you are in that modality, then there is an ending to that suffering within your head and for that other process that is happening in front of you, either in a person or a group of people. Now once you can come to that terms of how to probe into it and understand and find a way to end it, then that process that you follow through is your path. It's your own path. It's not the path that I tell you or somebody else tells you. So you don't have to go next door to learn new techniques. You can learn it right here. And that's where Dharma becomes practice. It's no longer a teaching anymore. It's a practice. It started off by somebody wanting to teach somebody something, but then it ends up with being your own practice. And that's why Dharma as practice is much more powerful to see than picking up 100 books and reading about it. Not to worry, I've done that. That's because we are always trying to find a method to end whatever questions we have. But we never go back and ask ourselves, are we asking the right questions? So one of the common things, the big sufferings that he talks about, is something that happens always. But something that happens almost instantaneously is another kind of suffering that he talks about, which is right inside our head. And that's where it becomes a very powerful tool for ending large-scale suffering, but everyday instant things that we face, what we call as troubleshooting. There is suffering in troubleshooting. That's where his his teaching translated into so many fields. They use Buddha's words in troubleshooting all kinds of problems. And there are all kinds of paths people found once they were able to get to that basic four truths. And that's where you find so many different kinds of teachings. There is Zen Buddhism. There is what they call as Nichiren in Japan. There is the higher end Buddhism called Mahayana Buddhism. There is Hinayana Buddhism. And all these terms, why I'm saying those words is that I was grappling with these words and terms as I was trying to find the essence of it. And what I found was, as long as you find some good teacher, and if you can see that he or she is able to communicate with your mode of thinking, and if you can test it your own self by practicing, then you've found the right path. Otherwise, you're always searching from one teacher to the other, or reading one book to the other, and the questions are they become so muddled, you forget what is the essence of the whole thing. And I think that's where, making it simpler and then expanding it gently might help. And that's why I wanted to talk about the Four Noble Truths first, because that gives you a clear landmark in terms of how things pan out. So when it comes to the short-term suffering that I was talking about in terms of planning, there's a process of what Buddha called deconstruction. It's a very important technique that he used. It's called the process of deconstruction. And again, it goes back to the question that me and Steve talked about at that restaurant that evening. And it's a question of who am I? So this is a very important technique that he deals with in trying to understand the short-term troubleshooting suffering that goes in our head, of deciding which way to go, which eventually leads to the larger problems that we face in life. And the whole idea of being, what Buddha called as being enlightened, is to find that method and to be able to practice it spontaneously. The more spontaneously you practice, you never have the actual instant of suffering. Right? If you can instantaneously perceive the thing coming at you and see it in the right mode, you're not going to be suffering at all. And that is what he called the end of suffering. The end of suffering is nothing but a very effective method of perceiving reality. So perceiving reality starts with your own self. So who am I is a way of perceiving reality. Who am I? You're checking you on your own self. I can call myself Prakash, or you can call yourself Steve, or you can the name, but the name was given to you. But who are you? You probe into it more. So what he found was, people have different methods. At that time, when he was trying to find out methods, there were a lot of other methods around, no doubt. I mean, he was going through the same trouble. There were a lot of other people, like in India at that time, there's a whole bunch of literature that are associated with this inquiry of who am I. So what he found was, he went from one teacher to the other to find the method. And then eventually he came to this technique called, we are nothing but 5 aggregates. He said, don't ask who am I. Break it into pieces and then put it together. Then during that process you'll find who you are actually. So nobody else can tell you who you are. You'll know it. And how do you do it? And that's where all these so-called, when you read Buddha's texts, you get all these theoretical frameworks. They look so complicated, but it's actually very simple once you understand it. Understanding is the biggest black box. So the 5 aggregates he talks about is, it starts with your own senses. So how do you perceive yourself? As a reflection of what others tell you. And as how you observe those reflections. Right? That's how we perceive ourselves. We don't perceive ourselves in any other way. It can be a direct observation through the mirror. So we say, oh, I'm a man or a woman or whatever. or I'm old or young or whatever, or I'm short or tall. There are so many different quick observations of form you can make, but all those go through your senses basically. And then you comprehend who you are to a certain extent. And if you don't like it, you do something to change it. So the form is the first aggregate, your form, or the form how you perceive in your head. That's your first aggregate. So once you have a form, obviously we are very biological human beings, we have feelings. That's your second aggregate. You have feelings associated with form. Either you don't like it or you're elated by it. You think you're the best or think you're not good enough. You're trying to achieve some state of being, well-being. And because you're trying to achieve that and not knowing what you want to achieve, then you have suffering. Same with form. So you see the word suffering comes in through all these 5 aggregates. First is your form. If you're not happy with it, you're trying to fix it. If you're too happy, you're caught up in it and you don't realize you're going to grow old, and you get again suffering. Feelings is the same thing. You perceive yourself as somebody, either big or small, and changes happen to that perception of feeling. You have to deal with it. That's another form of suffering. The third he says what is called as perception. Yes, sorry. So the third form is called perception. I didn't want to use the wrong word. So perception, so once you have a form and feeling, both of which are very closely connected to your senses, now you're working your way inside to your brain. You're perceiving it. You're absorbing it and you're perceiving it with form and feeling together. And you've perceived it in some form and feeling, and then you've concretized it. But that perception is based on input from outside and inside. And if somebody else walks in front of you and says, oh, that was all wrong, your perception completely changes. You're doubtful. Somebody else comes and says something, you swing to the other side. It's going to change. Perception is going to change. So to overcome this problem of change, we have a convenient method in our head. It's called fabrication. So because we are changing every day, we'll go back to form, which is the easiest one to perceive. For example, if I go back to the mirror every day and I see, oh, yeah, I still look the same, but my hair is a little bit gray here. That's okay, I can just cover it up or put some. Then I come the next day, I'm losing hair. So this is just form. But that's very trivial compared to the other two. The feelings and perception. Those are much more subtle. And they get ingrained as a fabrication in your mind. And it's very difficult to tease it apart. Form, it's very difficult, easy to tease it apart because somebody will come and give you a feedback. Don't pretend somebody will come and tell you. Then immediately you know, right? There's a checkpoint. But once it comes into the factors that factor into how you're thinking, that's where again Buddha comes. Says, you have to observe. And if you put all these together, form, feelings, perception, and then fabrication to prevent the changes in those three, you have consciousness. You become conscious. And you retain that consciousness of.
Sorry, I'm like,
That's right.
I got lost.
So you try to retain the consciousness of who you are. So we go back to that question, who am I? So who am I is the state of your consciousness. And its underpinning basis are these four form, feeling, fabrications, and perception and fabrication. So the consciousness that you're dealing with on a daily basis is going to change. So Buddha's main message is to deal with that change, basically. So eventually it comes to how you deal with that change. And all his methods. So now I'll go back to the four basic noble truths that he talked about. So we start with the end of suffering. So we said there is suffering, there is the understanding of suffering, there is the way to end the suffering, but the way is the path. So his basic tools for observation, or the mode of questioning during observation, is called the Eightfold Path.
What is
The Eightfold Path.
the Eightfold?
Yes, the Eightfold Path. And again, it starts with the same basic. So it's not too complicated, because I know all these terms are it looks very complicated. But anytime if you want to go into an inquiry, you start with your senses, how you're observing things, and you work your way inwards. As long as you're doing that, you'll be on the right track. So the Eightfold Path again starts with the sensory modalities. And one thing about the path is there is the right way and the wrong way. So asking questions to your own self and practicing in a sangha becomes even more important, because you get very live feedback, like in Toastmasters. So that's another thing, to find a community where you first set some basic rules of how you want to practice it, and then as you're probing into it, finding ways to get feedback. So the Eightfold Path is very simple. It always starts with the right view. So start with the right view. Based on the view, you have a right intention. And this is all within your head. And then slowly it starts to come here, which is the right speech. So right view and right intention based on what your circumstances are. And then the right speech, how you communicate your intentions. And the actions you follow it up with. So your right view, right intention, right speech, right action. Once you have action, then it becomes your whole self. It comes out of you. So it started here. The first two are in your head. The next two are how you communicate it and how you put it into, give it a momentum of movement. The following is your whole self. It becomes right livelihood. Based on that, you choose your livelihood, which is the right livelihood. And then because you choose that livelihood, that's going to be your effort. And based on that effort, you're going to have the right mindfulness. You're going to become mindful of what you're doing out there. And then you have concentrated on the path. So now all we have to do this is apply it back to the Four Noble Truths. At any point, you have Four Noble Truths. So if you say there is suffering, then you should ask yourself, is this based on the right view? Do you have the right intention to ask that question at this moment? If you have the right intention, are you doing the right thing to communicate it in terms of your speech and action? And if you're doing that, are you changing your livelihood to adapt to that? He makes it so intrinsic that you cannot get out of that loop very quickly. Once you're committed, you go on that path. And it makes it so easy because he connects them all. So all as a simple exercise is, if you put the Four Noble Truths here in the Eightfold Path and line them up and start connecting them and drawing circles around them and looping them, you'll see that at any point in the path, the whole idea is to repeat these Four Noble Truths. Are you checking if there is suffering in what you're doing? If your right view is not the right view, you're going to have suffering. going to be the wrong view. And if your right view is not right, your intentions are not going to be right. So you will not end up with right mindfulness and right concentration. You're going to be disturbed. And if you're disturbed, there is suffering. You come back to the first noble truth. You check your own self. You don't have to go anywhere. But the thing is, as you work through your path, because your problems are so specific, what we call as the self, or who am I, becomes a factor. You get too attached to those sufferings, and then there's no way you can actually experiment with it and find ways to question it, because it becomes something that you wear always. You cannot remove it and observe it. But at any time, you can choose to stand apart and observe that suffering. When you see that, you go back to the Four Noble Truths. And then you use the Eightfold Path to check on whether you are on the right or the wrong side of the path. And if you are on this path, then there is an end to suffering. If you're not, there are some wrong views, wrong intentions, wrong speech, wrong action, wrong livelihood, wrong effort, wrong mindfulness, wrong concentration. There is suffering. Back to the square one. And once you get back to that, you can work again. And at any point, you're working towards ending suffering. Once you become aware of these two components of his teaching, you're always on the path to ending suffering. And that is the light at the end of the tunnel he gives you. And that's why he says some sufferings are so huge, you cannot solve them in a lifetime. And that's where he talks about rebirth and karma and your deeds and actions, all these words that come up, that you have past karmas, which is the past actions. It's not yours. It's just your state of being a human being. It's human suffering. That you're born and that you're going to die is human suffering. There's nothing you can do about it. But what can you do about it is to become aware of it and see how you operate within those frameworks. I think that's where he really became what I think is called enlightened. When he got it initially, he was still not sure. But once he was able to communicate it, form a sangha, and have that people practice, and see it actually operate as people were able to solve it, then he said, yes, I found the way. And that's when he went gung-ho, traveling all over the world trying to preach it. So who am I always comes in between the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. I know that it sounds very formula oriented, but this is on a background of a very serious problem that we face, which is change. So if that context is maintained, these formulas become useful tools. Otherwise, they just become words we play. I think that's where the seriousness of the whole thing works into our own. We play with these, we have to play with it when we're practicing. We have to be playful with the whole thing. We cannot be bogged down by our own sufferings. Then it's very difficult to play with it. But once you see that what he's saying is a mode of inquiry which will allow you to get past the problems, then your effort is going to be in the right direction. Otherwise, if you see suffering as suffering and stop there, then the effort you're going to take in the future is going to be wrong. You're going to have wrong effort, which leads to more suffering. That's the challenging conundrum that you might have to accept initially for his words and try it. And once you try it, and if you can solve certain problems, then you'll see that you can practice it even more. That's one of the key things that I found for myself. That initially you have to take it for his word to a certain extent. When he said that there is suffering, sometimes your life is all okay. Everything seems fine. So then you have to spread your range of awareness. You have to see people around you. You have to see the whole world sometimes. Or you have to see the whole universe. And then you'll see the human understanding is so limited is so limited that what we call as suffering is not trivial. It exists everywhere in this universe. It becomes a huge thing. And then you have a reason to practice. That's what he told people. You can be very comfortable where you are, but that's not a point of comfort for you to just sit there. When you're practicing, and if you find a joy in practicing, that degree of comfort and pleasure is good. But the pleasure that you get by some euphoric idea or some thing is very false. And that will always lead you to suffering. That will always lead you to suffering. And that's why in a lot of his earlier teachings, he really, really talks about watching out for your sensory responses. And that's when you read about Buddha's earliest texts, a lot of it deals with sexual misconduct, or deals with, he tells the 5 basic precepts you never do is you never lie, cheat, do idle talk, have illicit sex, and intoxicate. Not because these are some problem issues in the society. It was always a part of the society. But for him, when he wanted the Sangha and put the rules together, he said if you're involved in these kind of activities, it's very difficult to go into that mode of questioning. So, but just by doing those, by default, you'll be excluded from the Sangha. And so even as a layman, when you want to try these tools, you might want to check on your sensory, daily activities, because that will make the clarity of the path much more easy. Not that those approaches are wrong, but if you want to approach this path, you need to look at those and have it as a checkpoint to see if you can tone it down. Only then these responses to these questions become more valid. Otherwise, you'll be on the surface and you'll find a lot of discomfort being pulled in both directions. That's one thing that I noticed personally for myself. Yeah, so I don't know. I can go on with this topic forever because it's such an interesting topic. But eventually he says even the reason why one of the ways Buddha is called is the one who is born. So that's why he's not a solid teacher. He teaches you to teach yourself. He's what is called as a meta teacher. Meta teacher means one who teaches you how to teach, basically. How to teach yourself on a daily basis. So the one who is gone, the reason why he says that is this whole idea of Dharma and the rules we set. Eventually we can get so attached to those rules, right? That becomes a way of thinking, right? So now you have, for example, if I've said all these rules and terms, that becomes a head cap that I wear always. And somehow I think I'm superior. Because I have these rules, I can understand suffering better than you or them. He says that itself becomes a problem. It starts to weigh you down. You start to sink in that Dharma that you're carrying in your head. So his example of that is, I'll finish off with this metaphor that he has. He says, how should I read it out? So all the rules of Dharma are like the grass, twigs, branches, leaves that you find by the side of the river of suffering. Don't forget that you're by the river of suffering. Don't think that you're doing it for entertainment. You're doing it to get over whatever suffering you have, or if you don't, your people next to you, or even further, or the whole universe. Don't forget that. At any point in time, you are at the edge of the river of suffering. So these components that you find with the banks, which is the grass, the twig, the branches, you put them together to make a small boat. And in that boat you hop on and you get across the river of suffering. And once you're done with that, don't carry it with you. If you start carrying it, then you're being bogged down. And then suffering starts again. Immediately you'll find that as soon as you finish crossing the river, and if you start carrying it, you'll find another big river. But if you drop it and start walking, that's the end of suffering. You don't carry the Dharma with you in your head and try to interpret others. It's for your own practice. Once you practice it, don't carry it and walk in front of others and try to preach. This was not his way of trying to maintain monopoly of the text. A lot of feelings were at that time was that Buddha was saying that because he wanted the monopoly over his text. It's kind of like his copyright. But that actually is a wrong interpretation. His idea was the next step in that process. Once you solve the problem with the tools, you don't take the tools and go bang somebody else's head. You don't need to do that. That's causing suffering for you because that person is going to hit you back. Or it's going to cause person suffering for the other person. So you drop the tools and you start walking, and that's when you have end of suffering, basically. That's his end of suffering. But then this is a cyclical process. So if you're on the path, you will find that these rules and these vinayas or understanding is no longer a burden, because they don't come to your head as a big bag of tools. They are part of your thinking process. They become part of your awareness. That when you approach something, you are heedful, you're careful. And what are you careful about? Are your actions going to cause suffering? Or is it going to cause the other side of suffering, the happiness? I think I'll stop there.
Does everybody still think he's a novice?
No!
So when do you have a few moments to? Does anybody have any questions? You want to just sleep it for now?
Do you belong to a Buddhist community here, like go to a temple here, or is there a community here that you...
No, actually what happened was I got to Buddhism in a very meandering way. When I was in India, I was doing my PhD. There was this monk from Sri Lanka. It's a country next to our country. He traveled through our place and he wanted to go sightseeing, and so I took him sightseeing. And he was the one who told me about Buddha, Dharma and Sangha. That intrigued me, and I never really got into it. But when I came to Saskatoon, I had a lot more time when I was doing my PhD, because in between failed experiments and all the traumas associated with that, I was trying to solve the suffering. So at that point, I started reading some books. And one of the books that I found really interesting was a book by a person called Alan Wallace, and it's called The Bridge to Quiescence. And
The bridge to what?
Bridge to Quiescence. Quiescence. Quiescence.
Quiescence.
Quietness.
Quiet.
Not quietness. Yeah, another form of quietness. But the word is quiescence.
Quiescence.
Yeah, quiescence. Sorry, my pronunciation might be slightly wrong. Quiescence.
The road to quiescence.
Bridge to quiescence. But in that he was very abstract, and then I really didn't get a real hold of the techniques till I found another person, and he's a monk from California, and he comes and conducts retreats in Saskatoon.
Oh, cool.
And his name is, all the monks are called bhikkhus, B-H-I-K-K-U, bhikkhu. But his actual name is Jeffrey, I forget his last name, but
Can I
he's
get the
called,
information on email with you, and then I can put it on the
Yeah,
website?
exactly.
and he's called, his name is Thani Saro Bhikkhu. That's the that's the name given to him. But he's originally from the US. He went to Thailand and practiced. But I think now I think of him as a teacher, because I find this, but again, you know, it's very difficult, because I'll tell you why it's difficult is because his text can be very, very deep in the sense of dealing with some very fundamental issues, and because he's in the monastic process, for them it's quite normal. But as a lay person, if you're not aware of the context, it can sound very brutal. Because when he talks about the body, it is, the body is going to rot. The words can be really raw. But basically, the idea is to invite you into that framework. That's the idea. But in terms of the overall approach, I think he's got a very solid approach because it tells you how clearly to. But I think over time I've learned to find out what is suitable for our current time. And I think he's a good teacher, but you have to be with him for a while before you can get a feel for it. But he really enforces the idea of practice. And a lot of the other books gives you just tools. They say, it becomes more relaxing and, tools to loosen up your mind and all that. But actually there's a lot of effort that goes into this. But if the effort is joyful and pleasant, then all the suffering that you face in the process is a way of solving it, not encountering it, right? It's you encounter, but you're solving it. And that's the difference, I think. So yeah, really, I don't belong to a specific group, but I found my own way to balance it out so that I can practice every now and then. And I try to use a little bit of analytics to make sure that I'm in the right framework.
Thank you.
Tell me again how the meditation fits into the practice.
Meditation is the inquiry. So the last two steps in the path is called the mindfulness and concentration. So when you sit to meditate, meditation is to find a point of focus, concentration. So you say, for example, we call him Ajahn. The teacher is called Ajahn. So Ajahn Thanisaro, what he tells is you can focus on your breath. So if you sit on your meditation cushion or wherever you're sitting and you focus on your breath, then that becomes a point of focus. And so all the thoughts that ring through your head calms down. And as you start to calm down, you'll find that you can actually you can gate it with your awareness. And that gate is the mindfulness. You're mindful that you're watching your breath and you're watching your breath at the same time. You're watching your breath, but that can be kind of hypnotic or in a trance. You can go into a trance and suddenly you're sleeping. You're asleep. But how do you not fall asleep is the gate, the mindfulness. And once you have the mindfulness as the gate, every now and then you're checking back. Is this ending to suffering? Go back to the same question, very simple formula. Or am I just fooling myself? Going into dozing off? Or am I inquiring that actually I'm reducing my suffering? And once you find the balance, then you'll see some relief in the way you think, and then you can troubleshoot it with others. Yeah, meditation is a whole area of exploration, but the last two steps in the path is actually meditation. That's why when you see Buddha is always sitting in a meditative pose, because all these things eventually lead you to inquiry, and the only way you can inquire is to meditate. So it's an essential part of the process. But the question is, I didn't want to make it so trivial and talk about it, because I thought that you have to establish those early understandings clearly, and then the meditation becomes a very strong tool. Otherwise, it becomes something that you sit with.
I guess I have a two-part question. Do you live in the city here?
Yes.
Do you think you could come back and do another presentation, focusing more on the meditation parts of it?
Sure, yeah.
That'd be great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that would be wonderful.
I found...
Could you lead us through a meditation?
When you come back, you mean?
Yeah,
I can try, yeah.
that would be nice.
You're welcome to the Sangha.
Yeah.
Yes.
Coffee shop Sangha, yeah.
I was thinking that too. You made Sangha.
It's amazing how practical it is. That was what
It
I was
is.
shocked by
Yes.
when you were talking to me that night, because a lot of times I thought of the spiritual movement of the Buddha as so undefinable or something,
Yeah.
but it's very definable.
It's
So
very
what's also interesting is the Buddhist movement, my understanding anyways, is there's been very few wars fought within the Buddhist world. Is that correct?
Though one of the things that he did after he became enlightened and to challenge the community at that time was to take his monks and walk into a battlefield. What he did at that time was very, very unthinkable. He used to take these monks without any weapons and go right in the middle of war and hold the person's hand who has a weapon and says, cut me if you can.
Say what?
Cut my head if you can.
Cut my head if you
Cut
can.
my head off.
The reason he said that was he was challenging them to say that this is not the way to end suffering. You can cut yourself for thousands of years. That's what you've done. You have shed the blood much more than what the ocean has. That's what he told the people. So when people shocked and they stood for a few seconds, stopped fighting, he said the blood you're shedding in the war battlefield, as humans that we have shed, is much more than how much of water you see in the ocean. That's the amount of suffering we have created ourselves. So he's what I call as one of the most powerful negotiators. And I think that's why people use his skills for leadership training and all kinds of things.
What did the soldiers do when the monks would do that?
If they decided to keep going fighting, what he would do is find more monks to come in with a first aid kit. And as they cut people, he goes and bandages them. That's where he talks about compassion. The other side of the teaching is much, much more powerful. Once you get, but this foundation, without this foundation, it's very difficult to get there. But once you get this, then you see that your compassion can open up, and then it's no longer a personal thing. It translates into something that you're doing for somebody else.
It's kind of more of a comment, but I like to think that I know quite a bit about Buddhism and everything. But hearing the way you kind of said everything, it was like wow, I got it on a much deeper level than I think I've got it in previous times, learning or studying it from other people. Some of it was even almost like a spiritual experience. I was like, wow, that's like deja vu of a past life almost. Wow. it's like
But I think
came
the best
together
way
so clearly that it was like that.
What Buddha said was when people came and told him, well, yes, I got it, so thank you. Immediately, he didn't stop there. Immediately what he said that, practice.
Yeah.
That's what he said.
Like
if you practice it, you're spreading those wings to alleviate suffering.
I liked especially I think the part that was kind of the most like a aha moment was talking about the Eightfold Path.
Right.
I could probably go on about this too long about the Eightfold Path, but long story short, it was it gave me a better way to apply it in my own life a lot better than other words. It was just 8 steps, and then I'd kind of practice it for a while, forget about it.
But the trick is to use these as tools,
right.
Not just as ideas. The other 5 things that I didn't really talk about, which I should briefly mention before I leave, is with any of these paradigms that we talked about, the ideas or the methods, you can get attached to the idea, right? And sometimes it doesn't work, you get detached or you start to hate it. So he has these 5 logics that he talks about: attachment, or a detachment or hatred, and then a state of confusion. Let's say you're not attached, you're not detached, then you're confused. Right? And then once you get past confusion, then you get too proud. Well, I know it. You get pride. And then once you get past pride, it becomes your method. It's your own idea. It spins in your head. So this applies directly to a question he was asking about meditation. So once you start sitting into meditation, you go through the same process. You get attached to the way you breathe, and then you try to maintain the breath in the same way. For example, you like heavy breathing, you keep heavy breathing, and then you start to hate it, you start to do shallow breathing. And shallow breathing doesn't work, you're confused how to breathe, so you stop breathing. Right? And then you find the balance, you get proud of it. Your mind becomes too active, and your mindfulness becomes so constricting, it prevents your awareness. The gate becomes too strong. So initially you had no gate, so things were going back and forth, you're all confused. And then once you have the gate starts to grow tighter and tighter. So finding the balance, he talks about, it's very interesting, the metaphor he uses is playing an instrument. First, somebody gives you an instrument, right? You learn how to play, for example, violin. You learn how to play, right? You just learn the scales, you know how to play. But then you say, oh, I can play this song. You start to play a song. And once you start to play a song, you get really good at it. You can play other songs. And you can expand your repertoire of skills with that same instrument. And you become a connoisseur of that particular musical tool. So meditation is very similar to that. You initially get the instrument in your hand, you start to practice, you start to create a tune, you start to create many tunes, and then you become a master of it. And then you can choose the right tunes when you want to entertain yourself. Actually, end suffering.
It seems like, too, that what he's talking about is there's never a point at which you arrive, really. There's always this next level. Like you coming here tonight, you've never been here, so it was a next point of what you might call suffering, whatever, at first. There's something to overcome. There's always something to overcome, right? In life. And that was what Buddha was talking about, always something to expand into, right?
But you are always expanding into something, but there is no suffering in it. Right. So that is the end of suffering. That's the end of the path.
Right.
The end of the path is that. That doesn't mean you stop doing it, but that is the end of that.
Others, basically.
That is the end of that inquiry. And then after that, that whole phase is short. It happens as a part of your thinking process. But every now and then you'll slip, you'll fall. But then when you get back, you have the same. What basically you're doing is, some people call it changing the operating system. You had an operating system in your head. He gives you these tools to replace it with another operating system. The only thing he wants you is that don't make it an operating system. Once you have it, you work it, you make it part of your process and see how much you can help others. And then you'll see there's always a potential for growth. So that's why he says the human brain never, or the human mind never stops growing. We think we mature at 21 and we just do things. But actually, according to his idea, even till the last moment of our breath, we are expanding our consciousness. Mm-hmm. There is no end to it. We are expanding. Mm-hmm. Because we all know. We just know what the end of this planetary system is. And we have observed through our telescopes how the galaxy is. We haven't gone past, we haven't even gone to Mars. And maybe in a few lifetimes we'll be traveling to galaxies, we don't know. But that's, that's ideation, that's pride. That's the human pride which says we can accomplish this. But what he's saying is that our potential for consciousness growth is an open door, endless.
Yeah.
Great message.
Yeah.
For sure. Wow. Do you have time for any more questions, or you gotta get
I gotta get going, yes.
Okay, well.
Thank you very much.
Like I said, Prakash gave us our time, his time tonight.
Yes, it's real.
Free of charge, essentially. He was very kind to come out here and share. And by the look of things, it looks like everybody enjoyed or took some value from what Prakash had to say here this evening. So, Rick, one of our longtime members here, he made up a little plaque for you, a thank you plaque. We've all signed it, so we want you to have this, Prakash.
Oh, thank you.
And
thank you.
Thank you.
From all of us. And also, I wanted to ask you is, Liam was doing some filming. Is it okay if we put some of